Thanks for listening to The Spark, Medical Education for Curious Minds, where we bring you the latest ideas and insights from faculty, students, and staff in UCSF's medical education community. I'm Megan O'Connor, Instructional Designer with the Technology Enhanced Education Group.
And I'm Karen Fleming, Communications Manager for the Office of Medical Education.
In this episode, we'll hear from fourth-year medical student Christine Zachek, who explains her research on Chagas Disease, a tropical parasitic illness, plus her upcoming research project in Brazil.
We also talked to Professor of Medicine Dr. Chen about his research into the detection and treatment of infectious diseases caused by the Zika virus, yellow fever, and dengue, and how a continually curious scientific mind keeps pace with the rapid advances in this field. So I'm here with fourth-year medical student Christy Zachek, and we're going to talk about her research in global health and infectious diseases. So Christy, first of all, what sparked your interest in studying Chagas disease?
So I was originally interested in studying Chagas disease because of my interest in environmental health. So Chagas is a disease that's transmitted through the bite of an insect, and that's how people become infected. And so for diseases that are transmitted through insects or mosquitoes or other vectors, when you have an environmental change or other component of the disease, that can sort of affect how the disease is spread among the population. So that's sort of what first got me interested in Chagas. And then the more that I studied it and learned more about it, I realized that it really had a significant social component to the disease. So the disease tends to affect people who live in environments that have poor housing quality, like mud houses, no floors, and that's where you can get a lot of infestation from the insects, and then people get the disease transmitted. So was particularly interested in that aspect, that it tends to affect people in poor countries in Central and South America, and then of those environments, people who tend to have poor housing conditions. And the other thing about Chagas is that it has a lot of heart complications, and you don't typically think of an infectious disease being a major component of cardiac disease, but really in these very endemic areas, like in Bolivia where I was working, you can have a half to two-thirds of the patients in a cardiology clinic being there for Chagas disease. So it's a really big burden of disease in these communities.
So you're investigating a tough-to-treat, tough-to-track parasitic infection. How does an inquiring mindset, for example, what you've learned in the School of Medicine, help advance your work in this area?
Yeah, I think what the curriculum, particularly at UCSF, has really helped me think about diseases holistically. So not just thinking about how do you diagnose, how do you treat a particular infection, but what are some of the other social, economic, other cultural factors that could be involved. So in particular, the study that I was doing in Chagas was to look at how people's subjective experience living with the disease and how that influences whether they want to seek treatment and whether they want to get tested and how they feel about how the disease is impacting their community. So I think really having that holistic mindset and thinking about the epidemiology of diseases are what really led me to think about this particular research focus.
So these infectious agents have the potential to mutate and spread alarmingly fast. How can research keep pace with this, and how does your research anticipate the changes?
So I think in terms of emerging infectious disease and re-emerging infectious disease, public health infrastructure is really critical because you need to be able to track what's going on with the disease and be able to not only detect the emergence, but develop data and risk factors and things for clinical decision making quickly in a time that there can be a lot of uncertainty when things about disease can be relatively unknown. So I think having good infrastructure for that is really important. In particular, in the case of Chagas, we're seeing that there's a lot of reinfestation of bugs in areas where it was previously eradicated by spraying campaigns or other programs. And also we're seeing resistance of the organisms to some of the insecticides and pesticides that are being used. So really, I think that's one of the main components with respect to Chagas disease, is that you're seeing this reemergence in certain areas and then also resistance that's developing.
So you're going to be taking some of your knowledge from this project to your upcoming one in Brazil. Can you talk a little bit how what you've learned in studying Chagas disease will affect your project in studying HIV/AIDS in the coming months?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to start on this fellowship. So it's a program that's focusing on HIV prevention in South America. And I think I'm particularly excited about the program in that I get to learn about sort of all aspects of the epidemiology and things like vaccine development, chemoprophylaxis for HIV, which is a huge component of global health and infectious disease. So I think sort of building on my previous knowledge of epidemiology of Chagas and thinking about social components of the disease, I can transfer that to studying HIV and think about more of the sociocultural aspects of people living with the disease, and hoping in particular to focus on HIV positive women in Brazil and think about what their susceptibility to diseases like cervical cancer might be, and how that affects their decisions regarding screening and vaccination and things like that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.
Now that we've heard from Christine about the issues and challenges related to Chagas disease in some of the world's most vulnerable communities, let's talk to Dr. Peter Chen Hong, who tells us about his work in solving medical mysteries, understanding new and evolving infectious diseases, and what's on the horizon for novel treatments and technologies to potentially prevent their spread. So, Dr. Chen Hong, you've investigated some of today's most dangerous viruses and infectious diseases. How do you think an inquiring mindset helps advance research into these illnesses?
So I really like my co-faculty member, Carrie Chen, who both best defined inquiry as developing a habit of mind, and in a way in which we all recognize the limits of what we know or what we don't know in science. And I'm a big fan of that in medical education. For me, in my work in clinical research, I have the methods of discovery in my toolbox and can draw upon them at any time to help solve unknown problems. It's similar to thinking of getting doors yet unopened, and we usually think about that in the context of liberal education. That is a philosophy of education that empowers individuals with broad knowledge and transferable skills. So we're not talking about Thomas Huxley here in terms of values in the traditional way, but a way of approaching scientific discovery. So you see a new problem like Zika, Ebola, or a transplant patient who's getting ill and you can't diagnose the infection. You want to get the old toolbox to understand who gets it, why they get it, how best to relieve suffering, as Dan Lowenstein always encourages me to think about. And in my own work, it's been thinking about issues of donor-derived infections in transplant recipients, in which case, we try to use new technologies to try and solve common problems that we know about. Same tools, new contexts, and new problems.
So, Zika and dengue especially, and especially recently for Zika, have been in the news and on people's minds both here and worldwide when they're traveling and such. What are the current challenges in detecting and identifying especially these types of infections?
So I've thought a lot about that, and I think some of the main challenges in diagnosis and treatment have been to do with translating the rapid discoveries that we've made in the lab to clinical and population benefit. How much data do we really need before we roll it out into the general population? What about false positives? What if you give somebody a diagnosis and they don't really have it because our technology is so sensitive? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to have access to these new diagnostic tools? Can we sit back and wait for more data? Or do we have to intervene now with the technology that we have? This is similar to some of the discussions that we long had about new drug development, but it's equally applicable when we think about new diagnostic tools that we have.
Going to bring it back to medical education for a moment. How does the medical school curriculum here support the mindset of the inquiring physician, the one that's keeping pace and anticipating these rapid changes?
Well, it supports the mindset in several ways. First of all, we gently guide students through structured discovery. So we want to give them the tool set, first of all, and that's by giving them tools in some of the different domains of education, so systems, biomedical science, epi and population science, clinical science, and social and behavioral science. So you need each of these disciplines or these lenses has their own toolbox. So you expose students to this wide range of toolboxes, first of all, and you gently guide them through that process of discovery. Then you also have them participate in a deep dive. So that's just kind of traditional mentored, led or guided process of discovery, which occurs during career launch. So that's kind of like a formidable pairing. You give the toolbox and then you apply the toolbox to a scientific question that every student has to take part in. In the old days, I think only the motivated students would probably want to do this. Now we're saying that we expect all of the students to go through this process of mastering toolbox and then applying it to a new problem. I think the other aspects of the way in which we're preparing students are quite ingenious, and that is where we integrate this mindset into every single thing we do at UCSF. So if you're studying microbiology, or you're studying infectious disease, or you're studying the heart or the lung, we not only teach them information that they know or we know, or here is like how we think the heart works, or these are the microbes that cause community-acquired pneumonia, but we also give them problems where we don't know the answer to, and we have them grapple amongst themselves using these lenses that I just described to try and solve the problem. There may not be an answer, but there certainly is an approach to the problem, so that when there is the next Zika or the next Ebola, these students at UCSF will be very well poised to jump in and approach these new problems.
You mentioned climate change briefly in one of your other responses. Do you see any connection between climate change and the spread of some of these infectious diseases, such as Zika?
Yeah, so I think when we think about climate change and infectious diseases, there are two ways I think about it. Certainly, there's the most obvious way that we think about climate change and infectious diseases, which is changes in temperature. So more heat can spread the range of vectors like mosquitoes, which can then transmit more infections like Zika or malaria or yellow fever or some of these other mosquito-borne illnesses, chikungunya, for example. You can also imagine the world getting drier, which leads to more problems with sanitation, or more flooding in some areas, which leads to more diarrheal diseases. I think the sort of insidious repercussions of climate change and infectious diseases is something that I've become more aware of recently, which is the social dimension. So climate change results in climate refugees. These are people who pick up and leave their traditional community because it's no longer hospitable for living. So in recent days, for example, we've learned more about the Somalia and the Sudan and those areas which are increasingly becoming very inhospitable for living. So you have these wide swaths of people, these climate refugees, moving around trying to find a place to live, and you may have politics interplaying with that, but certainly if they're driven by temperature or temperature changes, that itself is a significant problem. When you have large population movements, you also have potential social unrest. And when that happens, we know that's a risk factor for certain infectious diseases that you may not even think about in the context of climate change, like HIV/AIDS, where more social unrest leads to more unsafe behaviors, more transactional sex, for example, which can then lead to more risky behaviors, STDs and HIV, which you don't really think in terms of like becoming more hot or cold or more rainfall, but it's really that social unrest. So I think both in terms of a physical dimension as well as in a social dimension, we can see probably an increase in infectious diseases overall because of climate change. And given that social dimension, we've recently been awarded a small grant and working with some others to make a film about some of these social dimensions and how climate change can affect diseases that we don't normally associate with physical perturbations.
So we have more people traveling these days. We have a more inhospitable planet. Do you see some of the threats of infectious diseases now being way more dangerous than they were 100 years ago because of these reasons?
Well, definitely. So now instead of going around the world in 80 days, we can probably go around the world in 1 day. And I think that's probably how multiple infectious agents have recently come to North America. For example, when we think about West Nile, those mosquitoes probably came on a tire in an airplane to New York City, and that's really where it started. And then the crows started dying, and then that spread across the United States to the West Coast. So that by itself is a great, recent example of globalization and transportation bringing infectious disease on a big scale. So most recently, of course, after West Nile, we have chikungunya and then Zika virus, and then we have people who have not even been in an endemic area acquiring Zika virus sexually. And that's because of, again, people traveling to places that are not endemic and then being exposed to people who've acquired the infection and then getting it in another way that we didn't even anticipate.
So a lot of these infectious agents have the potential to mutate and spread alarmingly fast. How does your research keep pace with this, or how can you anticipate some of these changes?
So it's been tough to keep up with emerging infections on multiple levels. We don't know where they're going to strike next. We don't know enough about them. And they incite anxiety in swaths of people. So I think the anxiety is really a big issue that I think I deal with on a day-to-day basis when I talk to patients, whenever there's an emerging infection or something that seems to be on the bubble or the cusp. Because that anxiety can actually lead to stigma and discrimination, and people who fear that they're going to get something from a group of people who may have been exposed to it, which is usually not in the environment that they're used to. So research can keep up with this by involving large groups of people working together from multiple disciplines. And, I think in infectious diseases, we've been blessed by, working and reaching out to, these people in vastly different disciplines. So when we think about emerging infections and climate change, we not only think about infectious disease docs and epidemiologists, but also people who are working with animals and vets, and people are thinking about climate and in terms of atmospheric aspects. So I think bringing these people together, a lot of smart people in they're experts in their own field, in the same room, can have multifold benefits. First of all, you can see problems that people have approached in one way and apply to your own discipline. You can share technologies and you can have synergy together. So I think these problems, what they've illustrated to me is that we can't work in isolation. There are a lot of smart people around, and you leverage their smartness together in the same room. You become friends with them and you work together on a common cause.
Lots to ponder today, listeners, after hearing medical student Christine Zachek recount tales of the spread of Chagas disease in tropical countries, and Dr. Chen enlighten us on new ways to stop rapidly evolving and tough-to-treat infectious diseases. We also learned how the inquiry component of the Bridges curriculum, run by Drs. Buck Struhler, Michelle Hermiston, and Scott Oakes, trains UCSF medical students to approach these challenges.
We hope that you're subscribing to The Spark on SoundCloud. Stay tuned for our August Back to School episode featuring interviews with the School of Medicine deans. The music in this podcast comes from Poddington Bears Egress, licensed under CC by NC 3.0 and available at the Internet Archive.